Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crushing Land. My name is Jonathan from The Land Method, and I'm happy to be here with you today as we discuss another relevant land investing topic, something that you may or may not have thought of in your business, but something that is on a lot of people's minds. In fact, the reason that we're even discussing this today is because it has come up over the last number of months on numerous occasions with different students, and so we decided to put this out there and discuss it with you. And that is the types of properties that beginners or even advanced people tend to skip because they are told to, that really don't make a whole lot of sense. And we're going to talk about three different examples of that. So we're going to talk about properties in flood zones, we're going to talk about properties that are in mountainous areas, and we're going to talk about properties that are in non-disclosure states. And I'm going to start by saying that I have been in this business now for about 14 years in land only. For about 14 years, have done over 1,000 vacant land transactions. And if I were to take out the properties that were in flood zones, in mountains, and in non-disclosure states, I would probably be removing at least 3/4 of the deals that I have done. So that is just advice that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to begin with. And the reason that people give that advice is because, one, they've never familiarized themselves with those type of properties. Two, they just deem them as more difficult. Three, they don't really understand it. They feel they have misinformation about it. They don't really know what these terms mean. And so they're just kind of like, oh, we're just going to avoid it completely. And four, they just tend to take the path of least resistance. But in reality, doing that may actually put you into markets or areas that don't perform as well as perhaps some of these do. So let's jump into it for a little bit and talk about these three different areas. And we're actually going to start with the last one I mentioned, which was a non-disclosure state. So what is a non-disclosure state? Literally, it's a state that it can mean a few different things, honestly, but in most cases, it means that you cannot see the sales prices for properties. That's really all it comes down to, is you can't see the sales prices for properties. Now, some of these states are a little bit more difficult as far as what information they provide and things like that. The different ones vary. Certain ones, you can still see everything about the owner. Other ones, you can see certain things about the owner, but not everything about them. In other states, it varies completely by county. And so it changes from state to state. And because of that, some people say, well, it's not worth even going down that road. But yet the one thing that's always brought up, or one thing that people always make an exception for, is the state of Texas. Texas is a non-disclosure state. And yet everybody that teaches land investing always says to invest in Texas. In fact, many of them are located in Texas or work primarily there, and yet they say don't go do non-disclosure states, but yet they work in Texas. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And what that comes down to is just simple education. Okay, you're educated in how Texas works. Well, why not figure out how other non-disclosure states work as well? There's plenty of them out there that make a whole lot of sense. In fact, I've lived in a couple of them. I live in one now, and it doesn't mean that it's any more difficult than other states to invest in. What it does mean is that you need to perhaps take things a couple of steps further as far as getting information, as far as dealing with the local government, as far as comping properties and things like that. We're still using pretty much the same sources and resources that we do in any other state, but we're taking things a little bit further. So it may be getting a list from a third-party service instead of the county in a certain case, or it may be looking back at a history of a property rather than just seeing the sales price and things like that. So there's a couple of steps that take things further, but it does, again, it doesn't mean that we avoid these things completely. There's no reason to do that. And like I said, so many people run to Texas because it's huge. It's basically like its own economy. It's obviously something that people are interested in buying, and so it makes sense for investors. And they're willing to do that, and they kind of put that as the caveat and say, oh, well, don't do non-disclosure dates except for Texas, because they figured out Texas, but they haven't taken the time to figure out the others. And it's still the same. We've worked in numerous non-disclosure states, Texas included, and others. Absolutely no reason to avoid those states just because. Now, if you're brand new, maybe get your feet wet in a different state first, to just get the feelings going, seeing what's going on, understanding it, all of those different things that you're not really 100% sure what you're looking at. But really, after you have a couple of deals under your belt and you kind of understand the process of how this works from start to finish, there's no reason to avoid non-disclosure states. Another one, mountainous states. People say, well, I don't want to work in these states because they're mountains, or these parts of states. Northern Arizona. They'll work in Arizona, but not the northern half. Western North Carolina. They'll work on the east side, but not the western side. And then obviously states, half of Colorado, all of these different things. And they're saying, and it's funny because these states, I specifically mentioned those three, because those are states that people typically say over and over and over again are great states to work in. They're like, oh, they're some of the best states. I love working in Arizona. I love working in North Carolina. I love working in Colorado. But in reality, you're removing a good chunk of the state by saying that you don't want to work in the mountains. Why don't people want to work in the mountains? So it comes down to slope. That's it, right? They're looking at these things and they're like, we don't know the terrain. We're concerned about that. But the reality is that many people still buy in these areas. People like to live in the mountains. I've lived in the mountains the majority of my life. Other than a little bit of time that I lived in Florida, I live in the mountains now, and I have for the last 9 years. And I grew up in not right around the mountains, not in the mountains themselves, but around them. A lot of people live in areas like this. And so to alienate or remove it just because it's something that you're unfamiliar with doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you got to get yourself educated. Slope is a factor. There's no doubt about that. But that's where learning what's common in the area, learning how to read a topographic map, things like that will help you in making wise decisions. There's tons of properties that we have done in mountainous areas all over the country, different regions, different states, that made a whole lot of sense, and we did very, very well on. In fact, our single largest deal on one single property came in a very mountainous area. And so had we not worked that area, we wouldn't have had that deal, high six-figure deal. So again, that's something that would have been lost had we not worked in that particular area because of that misconception. So do mountains bring on some challenges? Sure. Because of slopes, some of them they're harder to build on, things like that. But that's where, being able to identify, again, taking things a couple of steps further, using the same resources, but just going a couple of steps further can make a whole lot of sense. And then finally, we're going to talk about flood zones. Flood zones is an interesting one to me because I hear it a lot of times from mostly from like private money lenders, hard money lenders, things like that, saying that, well, we won't touch anything in flood zones. And because of that, a lot of investors say the same thing. No, I won't invest in flood zones. Well, flood zones do create an interesting situation for the person building there. As far as the land goes themselves, it means absolutely nothing. But as far as the person building there, if they're getting a mortgage, they're going to have to get flood insurance and things like that. And so, yes, it does create an extra dynamic. Does it create less desire? No. In reality, it probably creates more desire in more cases than not. Why do we say that? Because properties along the ocean, properties along moving bodies of water, properties along any tidal water, properties along large lakes, anything like that, properties even along streams and rivers are in flood zones. So those are properties that people like to live on. People like to live on water. So people are happy to take that risk and they get the right insurance and things like that for those properties. So if you are to remove flood zones from your equation, from your investments, you're basically removing a good chunk of the state of Florida, right? People talk all the time about going to invest in Florida, but what are you going to do? You're going to avoid every coastal community. Those are the most highly desired ones in the states. You're only going to be working inland in the middle of nowhere. And even then, Florida's low lying. So even then you could still be in flood zones in a lot of areas. Pretty much anything coastal, other than things that are on bluffs and cliffs and things like that in New England and certain other areas on the Pacific side, are in flood zones. Things along major bodies of water are in flood zones. So to sit there and say, I'm going to remove this because of this dynamic makes absolutely no sense. And in reality, while the other two do have to be looked at a little bit further for land investors, when it comes to flood zones, they really don't have to be looked at all that much further. They do a little bit because it may be like a random flood zone that pops up and it's a very cheap lot and nobody's going to do anything with it and that type. But those are few and far between. And so this is where you're working on looking at what the value of the property is, what kind of buyer is it going to be, and things like that. And I mentioned like North Carolina earlier. I mean, we talked about mountains on one side. Now we're talking about flood zones. I mean, if you remove the whole, so you'd be basically removing all of Western North Carolina if you were doing this to get rid of the mountains, and you'd also be removing all of Eastern North Carolina to get rid of flood zones. So where do most people in North Carolina live? Right? Are they all in one central location? No, they're spread out across the entire state. North Carolina is actually a very spread out state. A lot of people on the coast, a lot of people are in the middle. Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, all those cities are kind of right in the dead center. And then a lot of people on the west side too. So it's very spread out in that case. Now, you look at like a state like Colorado, for example, where I talked about the mountains. Where do most people in Colorado live? If you were to split the state in half, it's right in outside the mountains, Denver, Colorado Springs, like right on the edge, all the way into them, as opposed to the eastern side, which is pretty desolate, which is the flat side. So even looking at it from that perspective, you can see that people don't change their plans based on these things. If people want to live in the mountains, they're going to buy there. If people want to live in a flood near water, which is in a flood zone, they're going to live there as well. So just things to look at and not to be afraid of. If people are saying avoid these completely, that really means that they just haven't taken the time to educate themselves and don't really understand what they're doing. And it's something that you want to look at. And the reason, again, I bring this up is because we've had this happen a few different times now, and in coaching calls and with students and different things, and they're looking at areas and they've said, oh, I was listening to this other podcast, or I was listening to this other information that I have, or whatever it may be, not naming names because I don't even know who they are, who they're talking about. But they're saying, I'm listening to all these things, and they're saying, well, these are not the best areas. These are the ones that you want to look at removing. And in reality, that's not true. They can be some of the best areas because, again, it's something that people want to live in, and it's easy land to move. So don't alienate buyers because of that, getting rid of an entire buyer pool because of that. Take the extra steps, educate yourself. It's not a difficult thing to do to move forward in this. And so if you take that time, you're actually going to find out that you're going to be getting more valuable pieces of property. You might be taking some steps that other people just don't because they're lazy and don't want to take the time. So you maybe have a little bit less competition with that. And again, the same thing's true with the non-disclosure states. Like I said, everybody's willing to learn about Texas and everybody jumps there, including plenty of beginners. I know many people that started in the state of Texas. I know many people that started and never left the state of Texas as far as their deals. But then when it comes to the other handful of non-disclosure states in the country, they refuse to, move forward and work there. So just something to look at in your own land investing business. If you're getting started, not being afraid to basically educate yourself and take those steps. If you're already going, you already understand the process. So now it's just adding in a couple of extra little steps in order to either identify details in a non-disclosure state or identify information about a flood zone or a mountainous region and what that may mean. So again, don't shy away from it. There's a lot of money to be made in those deals. It encompasses a huge amount of the country. And as I said, at least 3/4, if not more, of all the deals that we've done over the years would have fallen into one of those three, if not more, of those three scenarios. So sometimes it's in a flood zone in a non-disclosure state. Sometimes it's in a mountainous area in a non-disclosure state. And believe it or not, sometimes it's in a flood zone in a mountainous area if it's in like a valley part of it or something like that where a river's running through. For example, a perfect example of this is in North Carolina. I used to live there. And just last year, a hurricane came through that area. It kind of stalled over there, Helene. And obviously, that's a very mountainous region. And there's plenty of flood zones in those mountainous regions where the rivers and the streams and the creeks and all that stuff are. They flooded. They went over their banks. It obviously created a big mess. And so because of that, people will start saying like, well, that's why you don't invest there. But that happens every 100 years, right? They haven't had a storm like that in 100 years in that area. And people are going right back and rebuilding in those exact same areas. So that happens all the time. That's like saying don't invest anywhere where a tornado could happen. Don't invest anywhere where an earthquake could happen. Don't invest anywhere where a wildfire could happen. Don't invest anywhere, I don't remember if I said tornado or hurricane, any of those things, right? You just removed basically the entire United States of America if you start doing that and you start planning for like natural disasters. And so especially, and people don't do that too much with earthquakes and wildfires and tornadoes and things like that. They do it when it comes to floods for whatever reason. And we're just saying it's not necessarily something that you need to do. It doesn't happen that often. And again, if it does, and if it's an area that's more prone to it, it's usually a reason, like it's on the coast or something like that. And people do not shy away from buying those properties. They're buying there for a reason. So just wanted to share that with you. Again, have done very well in these areas. You can as well. Take the time, educate yourself, learn more about it. We discuss all of it in our information to help you with that, because there's really no reason to shy away from these type of properties. So thanks for joining us this week on Crushing Land, and we'll catch you next time.